Welcome to Metro 30, the Metro Monthly's weekly conversation with the community.
Hello, listeners. I'm your host, Zion Adissem. Our guest on the show today is historian and author Tom Welsh. Tom has written several books, which include Classic Restaurants of Youngstown, where he examines the history of local dining establishments, and Strauss's, Youngstown's Dependable Department Store, which looks at the history of the iconic Youngstown retailer. Thanks for joining us today, Tom.
Thanks so much, Zion. I appreciate it.
Now, before we discuss some of your work, I just want to ask, could you tell us about where you grew up and what that was like?
Oh, sure. I grew up on the west side of Youngstown, and I was aware of the fact from a very early age that this was an industrial, working-class community with some ethnic diversity. Much of the west side at that point was Eastern European.
Okay.
That wasn't my background, but certainly we had, you couldn't take a bus anywhere from the west side without hearing languages that I'm sure included Croatian, Serbian, Slovak. So I was aware very early on about the history, about the fact that industry had a lot to do with shaping this community because these people came here for a reason. My grandfather had been born in Briar Hill, and on Clyde Street, and the house was standing until fairly recently. And so from him, and he was born in 1893, so from him I developed a real sense of how vibrant the community had been economically, socially, culturally. So probably in the 70s, I had a sense more than many of my peers that Youngstown was not at its peak at that point. And this was before the steel mills collapsed. But those experiences, family lore, I think growing up in a part of the city that was really shaped by the development of industry, it gave me a real appreciation for the community's past when I was relatively young.
That's that's very interesting to me, just growing up in general, like in Youngstown. Right. But how would you say, in regards to the book that you wrote about the classic restaurants, how does that tie in? Like when you were growing up, were you aware of how there was a connection between food and community and how?
Oh, sure. I mean, well, for one thing, if you grow up in Youngstown, you're almost you're practically an Italian American, an honorary Italian American, because when it comes to cuisine, because we used to frequent a little restaurant in Austintown called Michelangelo's. We occasionally went to a little family-owned tavern on Steel Street, Salt Springs Road, called Molly O'Day's. And the other thing was that when I went to a parochial school on the west side, and you could just tell by what people brought to lunch, that when a neighbor's family would invite me to dinner, I got pigs in a blanket because they happen to be Slovak. And so much of our food culture is really defined by the fact that people from not only other parts of the world but other parts of the country came here. A great barbecue tradition. I remember C. Staples in its original location. After a rough night, college students would stop there late at night, early morning, whatever you prefer. But we have, our cuisine in this community was very much shaped by the fact that this was a destination for so many people seeking jobs, primarily in the steel industry. And when you go south, even to central Ohio, places like Columbus, you're going to find that the cuisine's very different. It's much more shaped by, say, Northern European influences. So, it's the restaurants are really a reflection of our ethnic and racial diversity.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, even outside of Ohio, many cities across the country, they seem to have local foods that are tied to the area's identity.
Right.
Like whether that's Chicago deep dish, tacos in Los Angeles, New York style pizza. Is there anything specifically that you would say would be the makeup of Youngstown's cultural identity when it comes to food?
Well, some of the most recognizably Youngstown dishes would be Briar Hill pizza, which came out of that neighborhood because during the 1930s, during the Depression, people in Briar Hill who were in dire economic straits, which was probably most of them, would get relief services. They would get a can of flour, every week from a relief agency, and the workers, the Italian American workers in the neighborhood, requisitioned bricks from some of the local steel mills that were discarded, and they built brick ovens.
Oh, wow.
On every other block. And, of course, Briar Hill at that time had cobblestone streets. And then you had this, smell of bread, drifting from the neighborhood. So it was a much different neighborhood than, there's very little trace of what it was then today. But basically the women would take turns. They would take shifts, baking bread. And if there was some flour left over, they would take the flour tin and make a pizza.
Oh, wow.
And the pizza was a very simple Southern Italian treat. It was a thin crust pizza, unadorned by our standards. Just a little bit of tomato paste, some peppers, and providing they had some cheese, that became part of it as well. Okay. So it was a treat that came out of that. Probably the first person to popularize the term Briar Hill pizza was Nick Levanti, who had Levanti's Pizza on Belmont Avenue.
Oh, okay.
But Briar Hill is a term that can be applied to St. Anthony's Pizza, for instance, which is still being baked once a week down on Turin Street in Briar Hill. And it's certainly something people recognize. Another one is wedding soup, which if you order wedding soup in another part of the country where they even as nearby as Cleveland, if you ask for wedding soup, you're going to get something that's fundamentally different than what we consider to be wedding soups. So those are two right off the top of my head that are closely associated with Youngstown. And when Pizza Hut established a presence here in the area, they were compelled to add Briar Hill Pizza to their menu,
of course,
which is an indication of how popular it became. There are so many others, though. I mean, we have unique barbecue traditions. We have a lot of Eastern European food that was not commodified, if you will, in the past. You'd buy it at church functions or fraternal organizations like St. George Croatian Center, for instance, on Vessel Road. It wasn't out there in restaurants. Not all groups were particularly good at marketing their food, but those Eastern European traditions are very evident, and you're starting to see more and more of them in restaurants. The whole cookie table tradition, I think, comes out of the Italian and Eastern European influence in this area. And I grew up with some wonderful cookies. Now I'm gluten-free, so I'm glad I took advantage of it while I could.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like how you did mention about like how resourceful people were in Briar Hill, like when they were getting ingredients for the bread and all of that.
Sure.
Now, part of the overview for the classic restaurants of Youngstown, it mentions that dining out was something that endured during the tightening of the Rust Belt. Why was that the case, that even in tough economic times, people still decided to frequent restaurants here?
Well, that's a very good question, because that was another surprise came when we looked at the early history. And when I say early, I mean we basically, the narrative goes from essentially 1945 to the present. Okay. But we had there was a point in the book where we discussed the Depression era and how many restaurants were thriving during the Depression, which again is counterintuitive. I think part of it was that bear in mind, a lot of these locally owned restaurants were not, you got a good value.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't necessarily, and that's one thing people forget. You're not only contributing to the local economy, but you're tending to get food that is, fresher, prepared locally, and it's relatively cheap. So I think that was part of it for sure. But I think the other part is that no matter how tough things get, you're going to have restaurants and you're going to have taverns.
Okay. Yeah.
People love to eat. There's no question about it.
So, what is the oldest restaurant in the city?
The oldest operating restaurant?
Yes. Yeah.
That's a good question, because the MBR probably has a claim, but the Golden Dawn has a claim too. And I mean, it depends on who you believe.
Okay.
Because everyone claims to have the first liquor license in Youngstown, Ohio. You know, in fact, there are three. What am I thinking? There's the Royal Oaks. The Royal Oaks. They all, because everyone got their liquor license in 1934.
Okay.
But there's a big argument about who was first. So I would say, in the interest of being diplomatic, those three all have a claim to being the oldest continually operating restaurants in Youngstown. Kravitz's was established in 1939, so it's certainly in the running, but it's not quite as old.
Now, would there be a reason as to why, like when you were writing and doing some research, I'm sure, did you find like there was a certain quality or maybe qualities that allowed some restaurants to last longer than others?
Well, I think part of it is first of all, the quality of the food was important.
Okay.
You know, that had to be maintained. The other was, I think they provided a feeling of continuity, because in many cases, neighborhood restaurants like the Boulevard, which sadly is no longer with us, but which was still operating at the time, and Golden Dawn, are in neighborhoods that have been diminished over time. I mean, when the Golden Dawn opened at that location back in the 40s, that was the venue of the Wick Six. I mean, you had upscale auto dealers in that area. You had a fairly vibrant neighborhood. The Boulevard was also in the vicinity of St. Dominic's Church. I mean, there was a fairly vibrant neighborhood there. The restaurants that have had success that oftentimes have been very successful at drawing not only new customers, but drawing people back into the neighborhood who remember the restaurant from the period when they grew up there. And then you have restaurants like, so I would put the Golden Dawn and the MVR in that category as well. The MVR's history is very entangled, if you will, with the history of Youngstown State University, because the expansion of the university benefited the MVR. The clearing of the old Smoky Hollow neighborhood, which would seem to be a disadvantage, in some ways helped the restaurant, because a lot of that had become blight. You know, these were older homes, they're relatively modest to begin with, and they were in poor repair. So when the neighborhood, when the university cleared a lot of those homes, purchased them from the original owners, that became more widely viewed as a safe destination, as you will, as a more attractive destination. And of course, they drew people not only from the university, but people who grew up in Smoky Hollow and people from all around the city. They were very, in fact, one could argue that they went from being a local restaurant, one neighborhood restaurant, to becoming a community restaurant, one that became a destination for people from throughout the community. Kravitz's is a good example of a restaurant that was operating on the Elm Street in two different locations from 1939 to 1970, and kind of reinvented itself as Kravitz's. It was originally the Elm Street Delicatessen. It reinvented itself as Kravitz's when it moved to Belmont. Retained a lot of its original clientele. In more recent years, though, it has really taken to another level what Rose Kravitz was doing years ago. She was appealing to people in the neighborhood, not all of whom happened to be Jewish. So there were Scandinavian delicacies that were served at Kravitz's back when they were on Elm Street, because they had a Swedish neighborhood nearby. Okay, and of course now you have Jack Kravitz taking it to another level with the punchkis, on Fat Tuesday, which is a Polish tradition. It's a dessert roll that's served right before Lent. The St. Patrick's Day week, and all those things are counterintuitive in a way, because these are cultures that aren't necessarily, they're different cultures than Jack's culture. But he's reaching out to those groups in ways that make sense, and ways that have turned Kravitz's into a very popular destination for a wide variety of people. So I would say the combination of of creating a sense of continuity, but also finding novel ways to reach out to new customers.
I see.
Right.
That connection between food and history, that can clearly be important to a city. What role do you think nostalgia plays in all of this?
Oh, nostalgia is important, I think. But one of the phenomena that I think is really interesting right now is that we have, when it came to keeping the history of our community alive, we relied very heavily on nostalgia. And the problem with that is that nostalgia is, by its very nature, a little bit exclusive.
Okay.
You know, I'm part of a club who remembers when Youngstown was vibrant, when the steel mills were in full swing. You know, when the downtown was a major entertainment and retail district. And I remember even hearing older people talk to me about what Youngstown had been like when they grew up, and it was sometimes the concluding line was along the lines of, "I feel sorry for you young people," you know, and that doesn't make you feel good.
No.
It's almost there's almost an accusatory tone in there, like you're somehow responsible for things changing. And in fact, if anyone's responsible, and I don't think blame is appropriate in this case, but it's certainly the people who came before me, you know, whose patterns of behavior contributed to these developments. But I think what you have now, which is really interesting, is that you have people who are older who remember when the community was more vibrant, being viewed by younger people as resources, and they kind of sense that. They may not know why, but they're suddenly viewed as people who are who can provide very useful information about the history of the community, because younger people are more and more looking to that history as part of their collective identity. And this shouldn't surprise us too much. When you think of Chicago, you know, how many people remember, I don't know, if you think about authors like Ernest Hemingway or Carl Sandburg, or more infamous characters like Al Capone, how many people are walking around who have personal memories of these people, okay? And yet you go to Chicago, people tend to be fairly well versed on the history of their community. They see it as important. And maybe being a mid-sized community, we didn't have the confidence of some larger metropolitan areas. But I think there's a growing recognition among people in general and young people in particular that history matters, that is something we can commodify to call attention to our community in a more positive way, and possibly even turn the community into a destination.
Wow. So. Now, even just going back a little bit to before you started writing these books,
Sure.
Before you then came up with the idea of writing about Youngstown's restaurants, how did you arrive to that point?
Well, it's funny because it was I had just written a dissertation on the decline of Youngstown's Catholic elementary schools, and that was published by a press out of Baltimore eventually. But I realized that my field was contracting. The field of foundations of education was almost disappearing before my eyes, and but I had written a book that really in some ways functioned as a social history of Youngstown. And I started working, just reaching out to people in the community that were doing things like the Center for Working Class Studies had something called Steel Valley Voices, started doing interviews with people of various groups, the Jewish community, the African American community, the Indian American community, even one gentleman from the Polynesian community from the island kingdom of Tonga, the one we have. And in any case, also became involved with Richard Scarcella, Sandra Sika, George Beelan, and others, Father Rujak, in something called the Ethnic Heritage Society. And apart from holding presentations at Kravitzs Deli, we also were building an archive. There's something called the Ethnic Heritage Society collection at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, which includes, material from Tabernacle Baptist Church, from, I'm trying to remember the Holy Trinity Ukrainian Byzantine Catholic Church. The interviews from the Jewish Youngstown Project are all preserved there, the transcripts. So it's a fairly substantial collection. Sherry Lincoln, who at that point was the co-director of the Center for Working Class Studies, she's now at Georgetown, but she basically she was aware of some of the things I was doing. She approached me about the possibility of taking on a big project, the history of the Jewish community. Yeah, the Federation was looking for someone to do that, to handle that project, and I had some difficulty finding a publisher.
Yeah.
Because university presses, if something is commissioned, they think it might be celebratory. It might not qualify as real history. Mm-hmm. And so they said, we'll do it for $25,000, and that was not viable. So I approached the History Press, which had already published Mark Paco's Remembering Youngstown, the collection he edited years ago. And I was impressed with that book. And they said, yeah, we'll do this. We like this project. We're not as familiar with the Youngstown market at this point. We would like you, however, since your other book was a dissertation, we'd like to see how you do with popular history. Yeah. We have 2 other projects, Strauss's Department Store and Restaurants of Youngstown. I said, would you be interested in taking that on? And both of them turned out to be. They were not projects I selected, because I had one book that I was doing, and suddenly I had 3, which is not an ideal situation.
Yeah.
And but I found them both compelling topics, much more engaging than I expected, because, of course, for some of the reasons we discussed, the social history of Youngstown is really reflected in the kinds of restaurants that were established here. Strauss's Department Store, the Strauss family were leaders in the local Jewish community. Clarence Strauss was the founding president of the Youngstown Area Jewish Federation, what is now the Youngstown Area Jewish Federation. So they both turned out to be much more interesting projects than I anticipated, and I actually had the historian on my dissertation committee review the manuscripts. He was unhappy with what had to be cut. There were space limitations, but he was pleased with the manuscripts.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, for anyone who may not be familiar,
and by the way, there were co-authors for those books.
Oh, co-authors.
Mike Geltz, who actually had some experience in the retail industry, was my co-author for Strauss's Youngstown's Dependable Store. Mm-hmm. Gordon Morgan really pulled Youngstown, classic Restaurants of Youngstown, out of the fire, because my mother became gravely ill at one point when we were working on the project. And I had 2 co-authors, Gordon and the late Joshua Foster, Jack Kravitz's nephew, who contributed significantly to the Jewish Youngstown project.
What would you say, what is it about Strauss's that makes that department store so important?
Well, I think it was you really almost have to go back before the history of Strauss's itself, because Isaac Strauss, when he came here in the 1860s, came through Castle Garden, as a teenager. Okay. He had a distant cousin by the name of David Theobald, who had a company called David Theobald and Company, and it was he was really, I guess you'd say, the state-of-the-art retailer of the mid-19th century in Youngstown. We were a rustic pioneer town where people engaged in haggling, bartering. Retail was very different. And he was the first in the community to establish a one-price policy. The price on that merchandise is the price you pay. Okay. He was the first to engage in these extensive New York buying trips, which ensured that local residents were exposed to some of the latest styles, latest trends. And he really served as a kind of mentor and surrogate parent to Isaac Strauss after he came here. And they were not close cousins; they were distant cousins. But he really looked after Isaac Strauss. He sold Isaac Strauss and one of his business partners their first store, the little woolen store, which became Strauss Hirschberg. That was the first department store. And they grew right along with the community to the point that in 1926, after Clarence Strauss had taken over the business, Isaac Strauss had died the following year, they opened up the store that we all know downtown, that building. And that was designed by Start and Van Vleck, which designed Saks Fifth Avenue. And they're the flagship store of Saks Fifth Avenue in New York City. Wow. So it's a real treasure, but But it was an immigrant success story for the first part of its history.
Yeah.
And even afterward, when the May Company, when Strauss's was purchased by the May Company, became a division of that corporation, the May Company was very careful about maintaining the policies that the Strauss family had implemented. Mm-hmm. And so people always had a sense that this was locally owned, even when it wasn't, because those traditions were respected up until the end. And even as the store grew and developed suburban branches, they continued to be loyal to the downtown. They supported efforts to revitalize the downtown.
Okay.
And so I think people had good reason to view it as a local institution, even when technically it no longer was.
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Tom.
Thank you, Zion.
And thank you for speaking with us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I appreciate your interest.
Of course, always. That's Classic Restaurants of Youngstown, as well as Strauss's, Youngstown's dependable department store. And Tom Welsh has given us a lot to think about today. A lot of great, interesting information, things that you may want to look up on your own if you do have the time. And for those of you listening, as always, thank you for tuning in.
Thank you again, Zion.
Metro30 is produced in collaboration with the Youngstown Radio Reading Service. Visit metromonthly.net for news, features, and the Valley's most complete calendar of events. And be sure to subscribe to the Metro30 podcast.